I'm sure that most of you who come to these lectures understand how extraordinary this series is, but if you don't, I want to re-emphasize how extraordinary this series is. There is really nothing like it going on, certainly in these so-called United States, but really anywhere. And it's quite a historical event, really, to have these people gathered over the years to ruminate and reminisce and rethink and think projectively and forwardly and backwardly about their relationship to Charles Olson and his thought. I want to put out a few different things, beginning with some quotes from Charles Olson, which might help to place things. This is a quote from 1952. Many of you will know some of his quotes. They're quite classic. This is the morning after the dispersion, and the work of the morning is methodology. How to use oneself and on what. 1958. As the master said to me in the dream, of rhythm is image, of image is knowing, of knowing there is a construct. And then somewhat later, actual earth of value to construct one. Now, these have all been cornerstones and foundations for the work of Ed Sanders. And I want to just touch on a few things here. One is that the students of Charles Olson, whether formally or informally, are as unlike each other as they are unlike him. And that is an extraordinary pedagogical feat, and really has to do with all of these principles, which are principles of individuality. Ed Sanders famously in 1961 tried to board a nuclear submarine in protest for said submarine. And he was arrested, and while in jail wrote a poem from jail, which was published by City Lights in 1963. But about the circumstances in which that poem was written, he wrote, this is 1961, they refused me my Egyptian grammar and a book on Greek metrics, the guard muttering something about a Russian code book, and I had to fast for a day to get them. I acquired a contraband pencil and began to write poem from jail on long lengths of toilet paper. The lines were kept short because of the narrowness of the writing surface. For 2 weeks I worked on the poem hiding rolled wads of tissue under my mattress or on crossbars near the ceiling. I cut oblong sections from the inside of cigarette packs and made a copy. At the time I was researching 4 main subjects: pacifist theory, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Greek meters, and Hesiod's theogony. I'd taken a course in Hesiod and had the genealogy of the Greek gods clearly in mind so I could write with assurance in a poem. For instance, that Zeus was the grandnephew of the specters of vengeance. I studied Egyptian in my cell by making flashcards. I carefully drew the hieroglyphs individually on small squares of cigarette pack inner linings, and then wrote the phonetic sound and translation on the back. So there you have a kind of primer in what was going on in Ed's mind and his attention to technical aspects of writing and of language and of meter. Okay, and one of the things that astounds me in Ed's work is the relationship between rhythm and history. Okay, and in 1964, Charles Olson wrote a preface to a book of poems by Ed, and at that time, Olson was 29 years older than Ed. Olson born 1910, Ed 1939. So Ed is 25, Olson is 54, more than double his age. Ed had first written to him in 1962 and sent him a poem from jail in 1963. In 1964, Olson writes this: Ed Sanders' language advances in a direction of production which probably isn't even guessed at, in which symbols and allegories are more evidences of than the more usual and recent and principally existent since the use of a new metric by Sappho and Alcaeus only. Prior production from 550 BC back, conceivably more interesting now as aid and abetment to help recognition of forms and inventions weak only because the size of the substance needed for them is like, say, the earth. That is, it takes the earth to make a feather fall. So this idea of it takes the earth to make a feather fall, okay, has been pursued by Ed Sanders in ways that are quite different than Olson might have envisioned, but are incredibly empowering. Incredibly empowering. And I just want to say a few things to finish out what I mean by that. If you read Ed's longer narrative poems, you will notice a mastery of pacing. Okay, The Life and Times of Allen Ginsberg, for instance. About halfway through that book, Allen's life just becomes a kind of series of events. He's going here, he's going there, he's doing this, he's doing that. As that happens, you begin to realize, oh, the man is mortal, he's getting older. You get towards the end of the book, and it's crushing that you see him actually, that he's going to die. And in the Broken Glory book, in a poem of about 300 plus pages, about 150 to 200 pages of that takes place in RFK's last few hours. Okay, so everything is compressed into that final time of his life on Earth. So there's an extraordinary sense of pacing in his work, of how meaning gets made over time and what its effects are. And I'll just close with a few quotes from his masterpiece, Investigative Poetics, Investigative Poetry, which really is a primer for citizenship, I would say. Sorry, I just want to find this. Okay. As he says in the introduction to Investigative Poetry, recently reprinted by Dispatch's editions, this is the age of investigation, and every citizen must investigate. My statement is this, that poetry, to go forward, in my view, has to begin a voyage into the description of historical reality. There is no end to gnosis, the hunger for data. In the relentless pursuit of data, history is open to the citizenry. No case is fully closed, and it is the right and duty of any one of us to never hesitate to open a case file, even upon the bloodiest of beasts or plots. And then, most importantly, he writes, lawyers have a term, to make law. You make law when you're involved in a case or an appeal which is in Supreme Court decisions which have expanded the scope of personal freedom, opens up new human avenues. We make law. Bards, in a similar way, make reality. Or really, they make freedom, or they create new modes of what we might term eleftheriarchy, or the dance of freedom. Yes. So with that, I will leave it to the essay.
Gloucester becomes the flower. Gloucester, this is from Olson talking with Herb Kenny in late August of 1969, just before he realized he had his final illness. Kenny edited the book section for the Boston Globe and lived near Gloucester. And Olson said, Gloucester was the last shore. The fact that the continent and the series of such developments as have followed, have occupied 300 and some odd years, doesn't it take away that primacy or originator nature that I'm speaking of? I think it's an important fact. I use it as a bridge to Venice and back from Venice to Tyre because of the departure from the old static landmass of man, which was the ice, cave, Pleistocene man, an early agricultural man till he got moving, until he got towns. So that the last polis or city is Gloucester. Gloucester becomes the flower. Then Gloucester becomes the flower in the pure Buddhist sense of being the place to be picked. I will project some glyphs I have created tracing key points in Charles Olson's life and times. including my own interactions with him. I've written a long 160-page Life of Olson, containing text and poetry, combined with what I call glyphs, colored drawings with images and texts. So Life of Olson, dealing mainly with the circle of Paulus, Olson's big concern. And then Our Lady of Good Voyage, where we always go when we come to Gloucester to have dinner at Destino's to look out across. And this is the Egyptian sign, Hech, for eternity, above Our Lady of Good Voyage. And this is Tropos, the book boat of Charles Olson, which his son, Charles Jr., and I built at the University of Buffalo a few decades ago. We called it Tropos, and we put all his books in it. And this is a drawing of a Homeric ship, the type that Agamemnon took Cassandra after the fall of Troy back to Mycenae. Now, I've written in poetry form his life, and I can only trace part of it here. He was born December 27th, 1910 in Worcester. His father was Carl Joseph, mother was Mary Hines. Father born in Sweden, mother born in Worcester, from Irish ancestors. Worcester. I heard Robert Creeley talk once. He said that in those days you could take a trolley from Worcester to Boston. Charles John Olson, baptized as a Catholic, grew up in a third-story flat heated by a coal stove. When O was 5, he went with his family during the summer to Gloucester for the first time at a camp cottage near Stage Ford Park. And then he went to grammar school in Worcester, and he shot up to 6'7". 1924 to 28, Classic High School in Worcester, graduating with honors, president of his class, captain of the debating squad. He wins the New England Regional Oratorical Contest and third place in the national contest, and his prize was a 10-week tour of Europe. 28 to 32, English major at Wesleyan University on the debating team, writes for Wesleyan newspaper, goalie for the soccer team, candidate for a Rhodes Fellowship. 29 to 34, comes back to Gloucester summer times, performs with several summer stock theater groups, works as a substitute letter carrier. His father, Carl, is a postman and very involved in union matters. Then he begins his epochal research into Herman Melville's dispersed personal library, 1932 to 34. He attended Wesleyan, working on his master's degree in 32 and 33. It was the height of the Depression. His thesis on Melville was due on 5/1/33. In the fall of 1932, he set out to locate books once possessed by Herman Melville. He sought most passionately for the, quote, lost 500, unquote. Those books Melville's wife had sold to a dealer in Brooklyn in 1892. Olson traveled many locations from New York City, Brooklyn, Pittsfield, and South Yarmouth, Massachusetts, and in libraries, till by June of 34, he'd located 134 tomes owned, used, read by Herman Melville. Quote, some he'd annotated and marked. including a 7-volume Shakespeare with Melvilles notes on King Lear. Olson transcribed onto 5x7 cards the publishing information. So it was his early decision to know the new facts early. And this is Melville's book boat, sought out by Charles Olson. There's the Feather of Justice. There's the books in the book boat that Olson found, and there's a picture of Melville. As Charles Olson said about John Smith, the issue is to know the new facts early. And Olson was lauded in American Renaissance by Matheson for his researches into Melville's jottings in the various books, and Matheson praising Olson's 37 essay, Lear and Moby Dick. And here is American Renaissance, which the much lamented Paul Sawyer gave to me after we did a celebration of Olson in Berkeley in 1991. And he recommended it. And Olson is praised in that. And so he started getting praise. 1933, Olson's father, Carl, passes of a cerebral hemorrhage, and his mother, Mary, moves to Gloucester. He taught another year at Clark, and he is noted for an article describing Olson's remarks at an anti-war rally described in the newspaper. Probably the outstanding contributions of the day was a speech delivered by Professor Charles Olson, in which he pointed out the inherent barbarism in man, the emotional forces that drive them into battle, ending with the warning that only by substituting a cause with as great an appeal as war, only by fighting war with the fanaticism of religious maniacs, could the peacemakers hope to avert war, even temporarily. It was an early estimation of Charles' analysis of the human condition, to be reinforced in the 1940s by his viewing of Corrado Cagli's drawings from Buchenwald and the learning of the cannibalism on the whaling ship Essex and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 1936, he met Edward Dahlberg, an early influence in Gloucester. And Dahlberg introduced him later in 1936 to Alfred Stieglitz. And 1937 completes a paper on Melville and Shakespeare for F.O. Matheson. September, returns to Harvard as a PhD candidate in the American Civilization program. And showing that Charles was like Jack Kerouac and Neil Cassidy and willing to hitchhike across the great United States, hitchhiking to Kansas City, to Seattle, and back east in July, and returns to Harvard. Gets a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1939. Writes his initial poems in 1940. 1941, lives on Christopher Street in Greenwich Village. May, June 1941, works 2 months for the American Civil Liberties Union as Director of Publicity. He met Constance Wilcock, and they hooked up and rented an apartment in D.C. in 1943. And he was collaborating with artist Ben Shahn. He created with him a 24-page pamphlet, Spanish-Speaking Americans in the War, the Southwest, his only publication for the government. May 44, Olson resigns from the Office of War Information to protest censorship. And then in July, he works for the Democratic National Committee, first at the National Convention in Chicago. And that was the convention that Roosevelt and the big-time Pauls realized that, analyzing Roosevelt's health, that Roosevelt soon would pass, and that the VP would be Henry Wallace. So it was a lot of grrs from Democrats. Grr, get Wallace out of here. Grr, get him out of here. Grr. And Senator Harry Truman of Missouri looked good to him. Wallace had a lead on the first ballot, but Truman swept into place, and Olson naturally supported Henry Wallace. Olson went to the 1944 Democratic Convention in Chicago, keeping his fingers crossed that Wallace would beat out Truman for vice president. Toward the campaign's close, Olson designed and organized a salute to FDR at Madison Square Garden. Everybody for Roosevelt. This is a big deal that Charles Olson organized. And one of his duties was organizing this Everybody for Roosevelt rally. And here's a poster from it. And made sure the entertainers, including George Jessel, Frank Sinatra, and Ethel Merman, were comfortable backstage. He was a good organizer. He stood in the spotlight and personally introduced Frank Sinatra. Then after the election was over, Olson first read Ezra Pound. He and Connie were staying in Key West at the bungalow of the Hemingway house. And that wrote daily on Ernest Hemingway's very own desk, at which, for example, he'd written For Whom the Bell Tolls. And with Ernest's book collection still on the shelves behind where Olson was writing, he pulled down Hemingway's copy of Pound's Personae, his first reading of Pound, who was very much in the news, returning from Italy and accused of treason. Here's a photo of the early, look at those eyes, early 40s Olson, at the height of his heat and his genius. Just a chance. This is from Kate Olson's archive, and this is the lightning of creativity. And he left politics, and he created in 1945 a poem that was later changed to The K, and marking his departure from politics for writing. Now this is a troubling glyph. It's a big glyph. I drew a big and it didn't shorten down, but this is a very important sequence of time for Charles Olson, 1945. This is the hydrogen, and this is the bomb at Nagasaki and Hiroshima. That August, right around the time of the first two bombs, Charles had been doing his final writing and research for Call Me Ishmael, when General Groves got his way and Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed. Hiroshima was hit the day before, August 6th, before Olson on the 7th visited the Whaling Museum in Nantucket, where he searched through old sailors' diaries and found out for sure in records of the ship Essex, which wrote of cannibalism among some of the crew after the Essex was hoved in by a huge whale and sank in November of 1820, leaving the crew adrift in open whaleboats. And this is a drawing of the whale boat being attacked. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and sleuthing out the Essex diaries solidified Olson's take on the capable evil, quote, man devours man. He visited Ezra Pound 24 times in 46 and then 48. And he finally broke with Pound after Pound said some things that were unacceptable. He goes to Key West and met up, trip west. He goes to California in 1947, where he met up with Kenneth Rexroth, who introduced him to Muriel Rukeyser, William Everson, and urged by Rexroth to meet Robert Duncan. So he met Robert Duncan, and he also met the important geographer Carl Sauer in the Earth Sciences building of Berkeley. I remember when I walked with Charles to his 1965 lecture at the Berkeley Poetry Conference. We walked by Carl Sauer's cottage at the University of California campus, and Olson raised his hand in salute to Carl Sauer. Olson worked in the Bancroft Reading Room, searching through Gold Rush materials and looking for Donner Party data from studying the activities of John Sutter. This was in his first sleuthing, investigative trip. You know, he was fascinated with the Donner Party. Later, like 21 years later, when I fixed him up with Janis Joplin on a date, and I listened to his conversation with Janis Joplin, and he was talking about the Donner Party. You know, reliving this 1947 sleuth trip to California. Anyway, Black Mountain College. The summer of 48 was organized by Joseph Albers. John Cage and Merge Cunningham were asked to come, plus Bucky Fuller and Willem de Kooning. It was one of those summers, like the Summer of Love, Monet's first Water Lilies, or the premiere of Hamlet. You might like to visit in a time machine. De Kooning had sold nothing in his spring show. Merce had left the Martha Graham Company and had not formed his own company yet. Robert Rauschenberg was on hand as for the discipline of Albers. And the faculty was scraping by on rainbow stew. Students worked hard to create what was to be Fuller's first geodesic dome out of Venetian blind slats, which turned out to be too thin and splatted all over but the idea was born, the geodesic dome. Merce taught a class called Technique of Dancing. Olson liked dancing. He took some of Merce's dancing classes. It was like a large dancer. John Cage put on the Amateur Festival of the Music of Eric Satie. Beginning that fall, the bard from D.C. named Charles Olson began coming once a month to Black Mountain College to give lectures. Meanwhile, Olson became involved and interested in the campaign of Henry Wallace for president on the Progressive Party ticket. And where I live in Woodstock, there's a big newspaper article about right-wingers attacking Henry Wallace rallies throughout my part of New York State, and I'm sure it happened elsewhere. So it was a campaign doomed to total eclipse, but a very worthy cause. So, 1950, a manifesto, projective verse. the lightning crackles come out of it. One perception must immediately and directly lead to a further perception. And a poem is energy transferred from where the poet got it by way of the poem itself, all the way over to the reader. So, and this is the Coptic, vowels are the seed syllables of poetry. And this is a Coptic listing of the sacred vowels. And of course, the consonants are the click tracks, or the consonants t, d, th, ka, ga, ki, pi, beta, phi. Those are the drum beats of poetry. And Olson, in his magnificent projective verse of 1950, picked up on it. This is a glyph about the first Maximus poem, 1950. Vincent Farini in Gloucester wrote to Olson in D.C. in May of 1950, asking for a poem for a magazine to be called Voyager. And Olson replied with a letter to Farini, the first Maximus poem, I, Maximus of Gloucester, to you. And Olson, who had campaigned for Henry Wallace in 44 and 48, kept his Wallace vision in lines such as, love is not easy, but how shall you know, New England, now that pejorocracy is here? How that now the streetcars, O Oregon, twitter in the afternoon, offend a black gold loin. How shall you strike, O swordsman, the blue-red back when last night your aim was music, 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 and not the cribbage game? To, O Gloucester man, weave your birds and fingers now, your rooftops clean shed upon racks, sunned on American, braid with others like you, such extricable surface as fawn and oral, Satyr, Lesbos, vase. Oh, kill, kill, kill those who would advertise you out. Mentioned in the first Maximus poem is Our Lady of Good Voyage. And all my friends for many years, one of the first stops we make is Destinos, so that we can gaze up at night at the lit up Mary. And this is the heck sign, the sign of eternity. And this is from a photograph of those startling blue turrets of that church. And one time, this poem recalls a bunch of us coming to Gloucester in the summer of 1987. And I recall Harvey Brown, who was, for many years, from 1964 till through his death in 70, was the main financial supporter of Charles Olson. He supplied the equivalent of a Guggenheim Fellowship a year for Charles in the form of checks. So I came with Harvey and others, and after dinner, Harvey took the Maximus poems, and he turned to that first Maximus poem, kneeling on the steps of Our Lady of Good Voyage, and reading the lines from the first Maximus, O my Lady of Good Voyage, in whose left arm rests no boy, but a carefully carved wood, a painted face, a schooner, a delicate mast, as bowsprit for forwarding. And then I would like to pay obeisance and honor to Garrett Lansing. Garrett was a good friend when in 1966, when I took psilocybin with Charles Olson and another guy and got lost in the woods. We were in this fancy stone mansion out by Dogtown, and Olson was talking about Algonquin law lodges, and I got lost in the woods, and the police took me to Garrett's house. Garrett, I called Miriam, and she talked me down from the psilocybin. But Garrett later always was cordial. In 1982, he took us on a walk to Olson's Tanzy Field. Garrett cracked apart the tansy leaves, smelling like walnut husks. He said he used them in making omelets by the feather mussy beach of Stage Fort Park. That's 1982. Tansy buttons, tansy for my city, tansy for their noses, tansy for them, tansy for Gloucester, and to take the smell of all owners, the smell, tansy for all of us. That's from letter 3. In December of 1950, Olson learned that he could cash in several $100s of retirement money from his year's work for the Gloucester post office. And he decided to withdraw it at once and spend the cash on a trip to the Yucatan. He and Connie had learned of a beach house in Lerma, rentable for $15 a month. But his mother passed away right in the middle of these plans, so he had to go to her house and dispose of her possessions, and then go back to D.C., and then headed by bus to New Orleans, where a Norwegian freighter took him and Connie to the Yucatan Peninsula, and then to a house by the seaside that there was their home for the next 6 months. So he was this hunger for actual glyphs, sacred writing. The Egyptians thought that the hieroglyphs carved on graves were actually alive and seethed with living motion. So he was on a bus, Charles Olson, headed south along the Gulf Coast of Yucatan, and saw out the window the ruin with a steep pyramid. He asked the driver to stop and let him off. As Dennis Tedlock puts it in his remarkable The Olson Codex, he works his way through the rubble of the ruin. He kneels to clear away from the face of a partially buried stone and finds what he has been hoping for: glyphs. I hunt among stones. So he was there, but he had to leave the Yucatan to return to the college, Black Mountain. But he said, I was very happy in Yucatan. I didn't want to leave, but I would love to continue. And Olson sent 46 letters to Robert Creeley using a typewriter he'd brought with him. Thank God for Robert Creeley there converting these letters into the Mayan, So he carried the glyph idea to Black Mountain the summer of '51. And they had a glyph exchange among the guest faculty. Ben Shawn traded Charles Olson a drawing of a glyph for Charles for a poem called Glyph. And then Catherine Litz created a dance called Glyph with a set by Shawn, music by Lou Harrison, and words by Olson. All hail the Glyph. 51 was the year that Olson first posited the term postmodern. And I won't read the letter, it's in this little book I wrote, but he was the one that started it all. Postmodern, ah! Kate was born on October 23rd, 1951. And the Olson house in South Lodge of Black Mountain was adorned with streamers of tinfoil, and Olson soon wrote an ode to nativity. '51 was the year, of course, his letter for Melville. The Brain Police, 2 times, the year of 1952, the Brain Police and the Belief Fuzz, that is the FBI, visited Black Mountain College to ask Olson about the Office of War Information, from which he had resigned because of political interference. The FBI also wanted to know about Olson's lobbying work at the United Nations. He wrote to Creeley about the not-so-secret inquisitor visits. "My life, my fate is herewith interfered with. I have to feel that shadow. This must be the old European thing anew, the secret police." Then, the figure of outward. Jonathan Williams, 53, asked for a book. So in April, Olson wrote 6 new Maximuses to add to the 4 already done, and Maximus 110 was published and dedicated for Robert Creeley, the figure of outward. Now, my generation, we all wanted, how come only Creeley gets to be the figure of outward? All of us wanted to be the figure of outward. You know, it was, wow. The O called somebody the figure of outward. Olson sent a final addendum to the Mayan letters to Creeley. The trouble is, it is very difficult to be both a poet and a historian. And this is the Egyptian word for mouth or discourse. Because if you're writing an investigative poem about Henry Kissinger, oi, oi. Or Nelson Rockefeller, I mean, how in the hell do you? Oh my God. All right. So I'll describe this glyph. Olson was really appreciating the writing and the historical significance of John Smith. Smith was one man who knew the new facts early, Olson said. Olson praised Captain John Smith as, quote, the psyche that split off and went to America at exactly that moment of Shakespeare, Daniel, and Campion. This is another wonderful phrase from Olson, how to dance sitting down, that always challenged us. And I have, it was from the spring of 53, you know, how to dance sitting down in a Max poem. And Olson it's thought it might be about Martha Graham. Olson, of course, took one of Merce Cunningham's dance classes at Black Mountain and wrote dance. He was very interested in dance. And he had seen Martha Graham perform back in 1939 and had sent her his dance play based on Moby Dick, The Fiery Hunt. But I think he wasn't referring to Martha Graham. I think he was referring to Samuel Beckett, whose character Murphy, in that great novel Murphy, ties himself to a rocking chair and rocks back and forth. And that's how to dance sitting down. Now, 1954, Olson did a marvelous course, The Reason for the Present. I found a picture of a 1954 television, and this is the Egyptian's feather of justice atop. And Olson held a class on, quote, the reasons, causes, and consequences of the present. And he had the Asheville Citizen Times dropped off near the college each morning. And he and students could discuss the meaning behind the meanings of current news. And it was during the Army McCarthy hearings, which were famous broadcasts by the U.S. Senate from April to June of 1954. And the only television at Black Mountain was at the house of the man who ran the Black Mountain Farm. So they all gathered to watch Joseph Welch, his famous rebuke of Senator Joseph McCarthy. "You have done enough. Have you no sense of decency?" A remarkable new journalism probe of Charles Olson. He met a student named Betty Kaiser, and they were in a production together. Betty Kaiser as Solveig and Olson plus others in a production at Black Mountain of Peer Gynt. And Betty performed Stepan Volpe's setting of, quote, Solveig's song, and it was love. Then, in September, she was pregnant and went to stay with her sister in New Jersey, where she decided to have the child with Charles. October 54, he met during Hurricane Hazel. He met John Wieners when Olson read at the Charles Street Meeting House and gave out copies of the Black Mountain Review, including to 20-year-old John Wieners, just graduating from Boston College that year. And John enrolled in the last class at Black Mountain College. And Charles decided to live with Betty in early '56. And in March of '56, Olson arrived at Black Mountain with Betty and the baby, Charles Peter. That fall, Jonathan Williams published Maximus of Poems 1122 and Black Mountain. February '57, Olson 5-day lecture cycle, The Special View of History, in which he said very interestingly, history is the new localism, a polis to replace the one which was lost in various stages all over the world from 490 BC on, till any one of us knows places where it is disappearing right now. Polis. He mentions it all over and over again in the early Maximus poems. Gloucester, where polis still thrives. Polis is eyes, very famous. So few have the polis in their eye. And then the Greek word polis for city-state, or for the Gloucester state. No Greek, and so I translated polis is this, to polis haute estin. An American is a complex of occasions, themselves a geometry of spatial nature. I have this sense that I am one with my skin, plus this, that forever the geography which leans in on me I compel backwards. I compel Gloucester to yield, to change. Polis is this. Maximus to Gloucester, letter 27, withheld. Polis haute estin. Polis haute estin. And he was, a lot of us like to forget our dreams. You know, I do. But Charles believed in his dreams. He had a primordial acceptance of Jung, I think, and he liked his dreams. And so in '56, and Homer says a dream is from Zeus. That's in the Iliad. So in his 1956 poem, As the Dead Prey Upon Us, he finds his mother in a dream, sitting in a rocker in the house in which she returns once a week. There's a blue deer also in the dream, and other entities, as he exclaims, quote, "Oh, peace, mother, for the mammoothness of the comings and goings on the ladders of life." And that poem, as a young student in New York City, went through my mind a similar mode of how Hal did. And then there is The Librarian, a dream poem in January. You know, it has those famous lines, "Where is Bristow? When does 1IA get me home? I am caught in Gloucester. What's buried behind Lufkin's diner? Who is Frank Moore?" That's a dream is from Zeus. Kai gar, tonar, ek dios estin. I wanted to solve the Lufkin's diner thing, and I found an image of it in that NET documentary on Charles. There's Lufkin's diner. I reddened up the Lufkins, but there's what he's talking about. Find out for yourself. Moving to Gloucester. This is their house, the door and porch of the Bard, 1957, 1969, and there again is this Homeric ship, because you could look out the side window at Fort Square and see the water. And I always pictured a drawing of a Homeric ship out that window. And so he closed Black Mountain College because they had no money. And Betty looked for a place to live in Gloucester. And in July 25th, 1957, she wrote an excited letter, quote, "Have just found a wonderful, crazy apartment, the rooftops of Gloucester. No stove, no refrigerator, no heat, but light, Charles. Oh, Charles, the light. And a little balcony to look at the ocean and gulls, flocks of gulls. Right at the wharf, 28 Fort Square, do you know it? And now to Garbo and Grand Hotel." So shortly after the letter, the couple and young Charles Peter moved to the apartment at 28 Fort Square, which he kept all the way to his finality in early 1970. This is an image from Olson in 1959. He met Allen Ginsberg and Gregory Corso at a much anticipated reading in Boston or Harvard. And when I first met Allen Ginsberg in 1954, he told me he put up a sign, quote, "writing," unquote, on the front door of his pad. No one had telephones back then. To say he wanted to be allowed to write without disturbance. And later I learned that Olson had a, quote, "do not disturb" sign for the kitchen door at 28 Fort Square. May 59, Totem Press published Olson's letter in response to a letter to him from poet Elaine Finstein. On November 20th, the editor Don Allen visited Charles with Phil Whalen, Leroy Jones, Michael McClure, and Olson took him on a tour of Dogtown, the rocky terminal glacial moraine on Gloucester's edge, with ruins of cellars and old houses. And during the visit, McClure noted women in the distance picking low-lying evergreen boughs for holiday decor. And he told them in Dogtown the story of Andrew Merry, a sailor who lived, as O wrote, by Jeremiah Millet's house, and who successfully wrestled an ever-growing young bull, but it had become dangerous, so Merry ceased, but then invited by all his acquaintances to watch him wrestle the bull for a final time on a Sunday in 1892. Olson pointed out to the visitors the exact location of the bull's enclosure. But then after drinking on Saturday night before the Sunday encounter Andrew Mary went out to take on the bull, and he was gored to death. After Allen and the others had left Gloucester that evening, Olson wrote Maximus from Dogtown 1, which was, to my generation, an incredibly seminal and important document. I was studying Greek, and in my senior year, I translated all of Hesiod's Theogony into beatnik poetry translation in honor of all the sections of Hesiod's Theogony that Olson uses and utilizes in this great poem, Maximus from Dogtown. So I was blown away. But then McClure remembers that Olson pointed to a writing desk. He had a makeshift desk nailed to a tree in Dogtown near Gravel Hill by the entrance to Dogtown off Cherry Street, where Olson had his visitors to show them his chest-high board and supported by a crossbeam and post, and how he would stand at the writing tree, and on this occasion demonstrated with a tree branch to serve as a pen. And so the other day I asked Charles Peter, I asked the son if he remembers his father's writing desk nailed to a tree near Gravel Hill by the entrance to Dogtown off Cherry Street. And he replied, no recall regarding the tree in Dogtown. My only memory is when my mother told my father to move the car when we were in what was an open field in Dogtown. And my father was so preoccupied, he ran over my foot as I sat at the edge of the dark dirt road. But anyway, I always thought of this writing tree. Olson's, I wonder if it might not still be there, but it might be worth going to sleuth it out. And this, of course, is the Bull of Minos, which I transferred to the Bull of Dogtown, killing Andrew Mary, trying to wrestle him. This is Betty. Charles, it's like if you have a pretty wife or a beautiful wife, like I have, you know, Chris Christopherson, you know, anyway, it's a long, it's a long story, but when they went on when Olson took them on a tour of Dogtown to go to the spot where Andrew Mary wrestled with the bull in 1892, Phil Whalen was tired. So Phil Whalen was taking a nap at Olson's house while the others were going for their trip, learning about Mary's battle with the bull. And Olson speculated about this great poet, Phil Whalen's motives of staying behind in his house. But Phil was just tired. He was not that erotic, actually. So, but Phil Whalen, you know, read Gertrude Stein while he was in the bombing turret of a B-17 in World War II. And of course, Olson was the archaeologist of mourning. So I have there's a shovel, pick, but also a camera. This is the mourning after the dispersion. And the work of the mourning is methodology, how to use oneself, and on what that is my profession. I am an archaeologist of mourning. So Olson met Ginsberg, And Ginsberg, around 1960, took psilocybin under the tutelage of Timothy Leary. And Allen became a proselytizer. He turned on Thelonious Monk, he turned on Willem de Kooning, he turned on all kinds of writers and poets, and he thought psilocybin might be the substance of the new age of glory. So he talked Olson into taking some psilocybin. And so Olson drove to Cambridge and then was brought to the, quote, mushroom house in Newton, Massachusetts. And Olson recounted later, when I took it, I was so high on bourbon that I took it like it was a bunch of peanuts. I kept throwing the peanuts and the mushrooms into my mouth. But one experience Olson had on psilocybin is that he felt he had the experience he was in a native longhouse. A longhouse, you know, like the Algonquin law lodges. And when I had an experience on psilocybin later, 6 years later, in 1966, he also told me that he felt like he was in the Algonquin Law Lodge. So, who's to deny it? This is hard to read, but this traces what I call the mallet of Pov, the mallet of poverty. Olson, from 1960 to 62, went through severe poverty and with his young family. In May of 61, Robert Creeley visited Olson and discovered that Olson only had $1 on hand. And he suggested Olson selling his archive. So Olson offered the original typescript of projective verse to Indiana, which offered such a small amount for it that he decided to hold on to it. Ed Dorn, visiting Olson in July of 62, found Olson utterly whacked by the mallet of Pov, with Betty fishing off the pier for food, and the refrigerator unworking and resting in the backyard. Olson told Dorn he might relieve the mallet of Pov by working at a fish processing plant. And it's reflected the truth of Pov in Song 3. This morning of the small snow, I count the blessings, the leak in the faucet which makes up of the sink time, the drop of the water on water as sweet as the Seth Thomas in the old kitchen my father stood in his drawers to wind. He forgot the 30th day, as I don't want to remember the rent. A house these days so much resembles so much somebody else's, especially Congolium's, or the plumbing, it doesn't work. This I like. Have even used paper clips as well as strings to hold the ball up and flush it with my hand, but that the car doesn't, and no moving thing moves. Without the song, I'd void my car up. The music cracker of all ownership. Holes in my shoes, that's all right. My fly gaping, me out at the elbows. The blessing that difficulties are once more. In the midst of plenty, walk as close to bear. In the face of sweetness, piss. In the time of goodness, go side. Go, smashing, beat them. Go as near as you can. Tear in the land of plenty. Leave nothing to do with it. Take the way of the lowest, including your legs. Go contrary, go sing. Out of that comes a marvelous chant of Olson. He who walks with his house on his head is heaven. He who walks with his house on his head is heaven. He who walks with his house on his head. And he adopted this wonderful chant from Algonquin legends of New England. It's a marvelous poem from the years that Olson was suffering his worst poverty. And he was always, he started being accused of being a, quote, difficult poet. I always tell poets, go read Blake's Jerusalem if you want a difficult poet. Because here's an example of a poem. You can pick at random almost any poem of Charles Olson and the Maximus poems. And if you dig into it, if you use George Butterick's magnificent guide to the Maximus poems, or other compendia, other essays, you can find from every Maximus poem something interesting and wonderful. I just took one example. A hant or haint on Fort Hill. Maximus to Gloucester. An old Indian chief, as hant, sat on the rock between Tarantino's and Mr. Randazza, so he ran back into his house. The house I live in, and exactly on the back stairs, is the site of the story told to me by Mr. Mizuraka, that his mother reports that the whole section is a breeding ground of the ghosts of dogs, and that on those very steps she saw as a girl a fierce blue dog come at her as she was going out the door. So there's information there you can dig up. Thomas and Antonio Randazza were fishermen, neighbors of Olson on Fort Square. In Olson's word, on Randazza's side of Fort Hill, an Indian chief is buried there. And there the Indian chief was sitting, 1959, on the stone. Mr. Randazza went white and went into his house. Because Olson was ever sleuthing, as indicated by this little poem from Maximus 3. Always researching and sleuthing, said Mrs. Tarantina. Occupying the yellow house on Fort, constructed like a blockhouse house, said, "You have a long nose, meaning you stick it into every other person's business, do you not?" And I couldn't say anything but that I do. So, in 1953 through the fall of 1963 through the fall of 65, Olson was at a professorship at the University of Buffalo. He went to the Vancouver Poetry Festival the summer of 63. And his pay, $900, which he could really have used. And then at the Vancouver conference, Olson was offered a distinguished professorship at the newly founded SUNY Buffalo by a classic scholar and writer named Al Cook, who'd been brought to SUNY Buffalo to chair the English department and to organize a writing faculty. So the job would begin in just a few months, and Olson, still in Vancouver, accepted. His wife, Betty, opposed the move very strongly and refused to go to Buffalo, though later relented. And the three, Charles and Betty, settled into a fairly fancy mansion, the Hooker House, in nearby Wyoming. And Olson began teaching in the fall of 63. And he was enthused by the black mountain-eyed gathering of students, followers, and listeners. Betty disliked being trapped in a rural house, however much a mansion, with Olson, for instance, tarrying with students at Oneto's after class. The death of Betty, March 28, 64. Betty drove that day to the nearby town of Batavia, purchased an Easter basket for Charles Peter, went to a movie, then drove on icy roads back toward Wyoming. It was after dark. The VW crashed into an oncoming truck, crushing her chest, unconscious when taken to the hospital, where she passed away not quite 39. It was just 10 years after Betty had performed Stepan Volpe's setting of a song from Peer Gynt at Black Mountain. And that spring, Olson was the proponent of finding out for yourself, digging up the past by your own fingernails. So he roamed the site of Betty's final crash, looking to clearly discern what had happened, worried she had killed herself and that he had not cared for her enough in person. Then I did a glyph of a smashed Volkswagen Bug. Harvey Brown was a son of a wealthy family in Cleveland who was something to do with machinery that dug out canals. Anyways, a lot of money. So he was 27, and he had grown up fascinated with jazz and founded a recording company. And he was what you could call shy, bold, and filled a number of notebooks with his own poetry, was very shy about it. And Harvey stayed with Jack Clark, a professor at the SUNY Buffalo, a poet, good friend of Olson, and Harvey Brown began auditing Olson's lectures. And then he founded Niagara Frontier Review, and soon, prodded by Olson, formed Frontier Press, which between 66 and 71 brought out 25 books. One of the first was my very own Pisai poems, with an introduction by Olson. And he started supporting. He realized that Olson had no visible means of support except by this college gig. And when Olson decided to leave the college gig in 1965 in the fall, Harvey started sending the equivalent of Guggenheim Fellowship every year, about $20,000 as I understand it. And this is a book boat from Frontier Press, some of the books that by Ed Dorn and others that Harvey Brown published, a magnificent press. So there was a Spring Arts Festival, and Olson invited Wieners to join him in Buffalo. And I was invited to go to the Spring Arts Festival, and then was invited to give a poetry reading with Olson and Wieners at the Lockwood, at the Student Union. And there's the clipping from it. It was a remarkable reading. I noticed that Olson read with a kind of riverine Scottish burr flow. It was a beautiful, I'd never really heard him read him. I guess I heard him later on I heard him at the Berkeley Poetry Conference. Anyway, Olson, there was a place called Oneto's in Buffalo where all the students in Olson met after readings. And Gregory Corso was on the faculty. And Corso insisted on smoking pot at this place in Buffalo called Oneto's. And so Charles, he says, Corso's gonna get us blown out of here. So he lit up some Asmodoro asthma cigarettes, belladonna cigarettes, and blew giant clouds of puff to cloud over Corso's pot smoke. Corso's gonna get us blown out of here. And after the Spring Arts Festival, Olson was invited to the Festival of Two Worlds. And his friend Ben Shawn of Black Mountain College created the festival's poster. And it was a chance to read poetry in the presence of the ever-silent Ezra Pound. He'd kept silent for a long time. And Olson translated something called the Song of Ulukumi, which is a Hittite religious chant to impress Olson, to impress Pound. And after the reading at an outdoor cafe, Olson expounded on something I had written to him. I corresponded with Charles quite often, and we were discussing how he could talk to Pound. And I said, Olson expounded on something I had written to him about a vision of Pound at 80, embarking on a, quote, revival of life and 15 further years of power, unquote. And Pound replied to Olson, Sanders has a sense of humor. John Wieners sent me a postcard from the festival on June 29th, which is right here. And it was all ebullient. We stay in an 8-room hotel just opened, commanding full valley view, an aqueduct built in 13th century. All are here. So, anyway. So then came the Berkeley Poetry Conference, which many of you know a lot more about than I do, although I did give a reading there and got to hang out a lot with Olson. And Olson gave his famous July reading. And I had a chance to talk with him about his translation of the Song of Ulukumi. And it was an interesting experience. In my little book I wrote, I find the original Hittite text, and I find where Olson took out lines to create his text. See, Olson was interested in things like Hittite and Hesiod theogony because he was looking to escape the Aristotle-Plato syndrome. He wanted to find impetus and ideas based on other early texts. And he said, when Robin Blazer left Boston for Europe on a freighter in 1959, Olson came to the ship to give him bon voyage and gave Blazer the 1850 first edition of Redburn, his first voyage. And just before leaving the ship, Olson said to Blazer, "Don't get stuck in Europe. Head for Hittite country." And so I add some Hittite text to my glyph there. Olson gave a powerful reading, which was both offensive and exhilarating to people. I think Robert Duncan may have left. I stayed, of course, to savor the beauty of it. And at the end, I picked up his Cutty Sark bottle from his lectern. You know, he was smart. He kept a little bottle, you know, you could, when he was in Harvard in 1930, he probably would have had a silver flask. Gloucester was his permanent place. This is an Egyptian boat I drew out in the harbor. This is from Kate Olson's archive. This is looking out the window at 28 Fort Square. Olson wrote a series of letters to the editor of the Gloucester Times that were printed. And in the fall of 1965, I was preparing a new issue of my magazine, Fuck You, a magazine of the arts. And I had acquired a bunch of great texts. And Olson submitted a text. And he also sent me this letter that he had been published in, called A Scream to the Editor, about the tearing down of the Solomon Davis house. And I kept, this is all that's left after 50 years of residing in my archive, because I wrote to Philip Well, the editor at the Gloucester Times. I wanted 500 copies of this letter to staple into every issue of my magazine as a scream from Olson. But he said that it had been a popular letter, and he didn't have 500 anymore. So it was a scream to the editor. Moan the loss, another house is gone. Bemoan the present, which assumes its taste. Bemoan the easiness of smashing anything. Moan Solomon Davis's house, gone for the YMCA to build another of its cheap, benevolent places bankers raise money for, and who loan money for new houses. Each destruction doubles our loss and doubles bankers' gains when 4 columns. So that's December 3rd, 1965, and here's a picture of the Solomon Davis house. My bookstore was raided in early 1966, right when I was trying to get all the getting copies of this Scream to the Editor letter. I wanted 500 copies from the editor of the Gloucester Times. Right as I was trying to get that, the police raided my bookstore and took away thousands. I mean, now I see on the internet, these fuzz took away like $50,000 worth of archive, you know, but I never could get it back. But so I told Olson about this, and he said, "Call on me for anything, money, attestation. I can't see how you can have any trouble at all. But if it is a matter of your life and freedom, sir, I'll walk to appear in court in Manhattan for you. Love, O." All right. Panagrady rented a house in Gloucester in the summer of 1966. Now, before that, I had tried to trigger off a relationship between Panagrady, who was a supporter of the arts. She liked to throw fancy soirees for Norman Mailer or for the German group 47 or Gunter Grass, or, you know. And I said, why are you supporting these prose writers when there are great poets you could support? And I mentioned Charles Olson. So she finally rented a house in Gloucester in the summer of '66, but she on the edge of Dogtown and the Dennison house. But John Wieners, meanwhile, had crept in and had a relationship with Pana. in early October, Ken Weaver and I came to Gloucester to see Charles. And he was using the Black Mountain stamp as the doorstop for his pad. It was interesting. And he had to clear, he wanted to make us tea. He had to clear stuff off the kitchen stove to make us tea. And we decided Tim Leary had given him a vial of psilocybin. And also Leary had given him a vial of pure LSD. Now, I knew enough about LSD. You take 250 micrograms. I mean, you don't. He said, Olson handed it to me and says, "Want a swig?" I said, "Swig?" I mean, you can't. So we decided not to swig off of the LSD vial, but he had these little orange pills, psilocybin. So I took 8, and Olson was 6'7", so he took like 14, and we decided to drive out. We were at his house on Fort Square, and we decided to drive out to and this is well drawn in my book. This is driving to Dogtown or to Riverdale, and I thought, wow, I'm freaked out until we took this. I was having visual problems with this psilocybin, but I thought Olson's going to be cool. But I looked up and he was driving, but he had turned into Poseidon with tridents and gewgaws in his hair and fish, and I thought, oh my God. And then he looked over at some boulders at the side of the road, and he said, "Woo, look at the elephants." So I knew we were in for an experience. And so we went into this nice stone fancy pad, and Olson was talking away, and he mentioned the Algonquin Law Lodge, and like I said, I stumbled around and got lost in the woods and got picked up by the police and was taken to Garrett Lansing's house, where I called my wife Miriam. She used to talk me down from weird trips. Like one time at a Howard Johnson in Cleveland, some bikers had slipped us STP. So anyway, she was my talk down person in the 60s. In the fall of '66, Olson and Panagrady took the Empress of Canada from Montreal to Liverpool. And Olson brought his researches and all-night conversations to Europe. And I received a Christmas card from Pana and a handwritten text. Charles and I are taking a lovely big house in Regent's Park for the next half year. So you'll have to come visit. So he did write a poem for Maximus III, but he had a heart attack in Berlin, I think. And frightened for his life, he stayed in bed a few days. And Carvey Brown, loyal as ever, flew over for a visit and noted he thought the Olson-Grady relationship, quote, was over. So he returned in July '67 to Gloucester in time for what they call the Summer of Love. So maybe this is going on too long. I don't know. He wrote This is another glyph about something he wrote around the time he gave the Beloit poetry lectures in March. And it's key to his understanding his evolution. He said, wholly absorbed is this huge lake, the big inner lake, indicated by the blue glyph lines. The inner lake, wholly absorbed into my own conduits to an inner nature or subterranean lake, the depths or bounds of which I more and more explore and know more of, in that sense that other than that all else closes out, and I tend further to fall into the beloved lake. Janis Joplin. I was friends with Janis Joplin for the final 3 or 4 years of her life. I knew she was looking for songs for her new album, Cheap Thrills, I guess it was called. And Olson, after the Beloit lectures in March, had gone on to California, where he was camped out on the fold-out bed of Don Allen in San Francisco. So I told Janis that I know a great poet, and you should meet him. You know, I thought at least he could do some lyrics. I knew she was looking for song lyrics, so I figured, well, she could write a song for him. Or, you know, both were single and a great poet, great singer, who knows? So I got Grove Press, Don Allen, to pay for a fancy meal at a Chinese restaurant. And we stuck it on Grove Press. Thank you, Barney Rossett. And so Charles and I arranged for Olson and Janis to sit together. So I'm you know, trying to be nonchalant and monitor what's going on. And then all of a sudden, I hear the word Donner Party. Olson is reliving his 1947 researches into Sutter's Mill and the Donner Party that he conducted during that early trip to California. And he's reliving, being so smart, he probably remembers a day-by-day chronology of the Donner Party. And Janis, you know, not into Donner Party. So she goes off to play pool at a pool. Anyway, she's playing pool, and that was it. So all my efforts at fixing her up. So this is for the rest of the life of the species. Herb Kenny. Well, Charles, what do you think the future of Gloucester and Cape Ann will be? Olson. An image of creation and of human life for the rest of the life of the species. And I drew a glyph of him. This is the inner harbor, you know, his pad at 28 Fort Square. He's like the protector of the harbor of Gloucester. Beautiful. So Olson says, to Herb Kenny, you can never lose to the city council if your case is love. I even helped in that marsh fight over on Essex Avenue. The state refused the permit, happily, because of some aquarian life they claimed might be destroyed. August 1969. And then Gloucester as the last polis. Oh, to Herb Kenny in late August. The migratory act of man ended in Gloucester, because Gloucester began this continent, so that the last polis or city is Gloucester, see? Therefore, I think that in a sense, man now is either going to rediscover the earth or is going to leave it, whichever way you read it. Then Gloucester becomes the flower, in the pure Buddhist sense of being the place to be picked. The fire sermon, the truth, the truth, the truth figure. And this, of course, is the Egyptian, is Paulus' eyes. Paulus's eyes. Charles hooks up in late summer, early fall of '69 with Charles Bower, who had been one of his students in Buffalo. And he invites Bower to his pad, to Gloucester. And Bower went out for sandwiches and noticed there was no reverse in Olson's beach wagon. Bower, I was visiting here, and I had to borrow his beach wagon, which had no reverse on it. I went out to get some sandwiches. All of a sudden, I discovered there was no reverse. I came back and I said, there is no reverse on your car. And he looked at me as if there should be no reverse on any car and said, let me tell you something. Never get yourself in a situation where you have to go backwards. So then he goes to Bower's house in Mansfield, stays a couple of weeks, and he seemed to determine to reside with Bower. And Bower arranged, probably just to get him out of his pad, arranged a teaching position in the English department as a visiting professor. And Olson held a series of graduate seminars which lasted for 8 weeks. But by November, his health became an issue, such as a continuing pain in the left side of his face and a hurtful earache, so that a week after Thanksgiving, he entered Manchester Memorial Hospital for tests. His pain increased, and after 3 weeks in the hospital, a biopsy revealed a cancer of the liver. Olson had gone to his daughter Kate's graduation a few weeks earlier. So Olson called his daughter Kate. I'm here in the hospital. They don't know what's the matter with me, but tomorrow they are going to put some gold inside me, and that will tell. Kate drove to the hospital in Connecticut to be with him. December 16th, on a roll of towels, he created the secret of the black chrysanthemum, sealing it and asking it be kept with him all the while he was still alive. Wanting another 10. I really wanted 10 more years to look and listen and write, he said to a friend. No doubt to, quote, finish, unquote, the inexhaustible Maximus, and to enjoy, as he earlier said, quote, this earthly paradise. December 18th, Harvey brought Olson by ambulance from Manchester to New York Hospital, hoping for a miracle or a liver transplant. Kate was at his side when I first visited him at New York Hospital. They misplaced his dentures in the X-ray department. Late 69, very early 70, he sat holding forth in a 12th floor solarium, covered with a serape, perhaps the one Jonathan Williams photographed him wearing back from the Yucatan in 1951. A young woman, also a patient, vowing that she was going to survive. O's roommate, Olson told me, was a businessman who checked his stocks every day. A New York book dealer showed up with a stack of Olson's books to sign. I visited as often as I could. I was busy lining up a book contract to cover the Manson Group's upcoming trials and doing a lot of research on what they called the Tate LaBianca murders. A few copies of Charles Olson's Letters for Origin edited by Albert Glover, just published, were on hand in Olson's room. Olson signed my copy, quote, "Like my writing, which sticks up forever, the writer, Zoe," Greek, Zoe, for life. The oboe departs. He passed away January 10th. And when my own mother passed away in 1957, I saw in the sky a skyboat, which I thought at the time was bearing my mother away. And this is the O-boat departing. I'm going to hate to leave this earthly paradise. He really liked to live. He was arguing and talking with, when you visited him, he was willing to talk about the latest politics, when you visited him in New York Hospital. And here's another picture of the O-boat above Thatcher Island at Bass Rocks. And Charles Jr. told me the other day that out of a chasm at Bass Rocks, he's pulled a big boulder, dark boulder, and he's placed it next to Olson's and Betty Olson's gravestone in the cemetery. Invites people to come take a look at it. I'm not sure what his plans are for it. Maybe the slate one is cracking, and maybe he intends to use it and the O-boat, back in '83 when I gave the Olson lectures at the University of Buffalo, Charles Jr. came along and came to sit in on them, and he and I built the good ship Tropos, where we stacked all of Olson's books that we had, and it was Olson's book boat. So the Olson book boat, Call Me Ishmael, The Post Office, YNX, Projective Verse, Letter for Melville, In Cold Hell and Thicket, Maximus Poems, Mayan Letters, more Maximus Poems, Orion, The Distances, Maximus Poems 1960, Human Universe and Other Essays, Reading at Berkeley, Selected Writings, Maximus Poems, The Maximus Poems Volume 3. Quite a boat, a wonderful boat, a beautiful boat. This is the card that the funeral home gave out for his funeral. And we went to his viewing, and he was resplendent in that new white fancy suit he purchased. And the night before the funeral, in the funeral home, he lay in a white linen suit in an open coffin. A sturdy, white-haired guy with a furrowed and weathered face, whom I thought might be a local fisherman, walked close to the quiet bard and exclaimed, "Charlie, you're beautiful." And I agreed. A glyph of the gravestone. I heard that Kate Olson, the daughter, came up with the idea of having a slate. There is a wonderful Quaker cemetery here in Gloucester that has beautiful old slate gravestones. Gloucester becomes the flower. And he who walks with his house on his head is heaven. He who walks with his house on his head is heaven. Thank you.